Hello. Let's walk with Jesus on this Tuesday before the cross. Now, you remember that we summarized chapter 21 of Matthew with belief equals a pure heart equals prayer or communion with the Father, communion with the Father equals authority, and authority equals fruit. Now, he begins Tuesday in Matthew chapter 22 with the parable of the wedding banquet. And when you read the parable of the wedding banquet, you're going to want to go to Revelation chapter 19, verse 7. Let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory, for the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. The bride, that's the church. That's you and me, all of us together. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. And then in parentheses, fine linen stands for the righteous acts of the saints. Fine linen stands for the fruit that comes from the authority that we receive when we commune with the Father. So following the parable of the wedding banquet, we have 4 questions. We have a trap, we have a trick question, we have a test question, and then we have the terminal question asked by Jesus himself. The first question to trap Jesus, trying to get him to say anything that they can take to the Roman government and accuse him with. But his answer to the question is, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. He clearly makes a distinction between God and Caesar. Now, if you want to do a little study, you can and will discover that Caesar thought he was a god. Not as big as Zeus or Apollo, but he was a god. And he declared that. And if you disagreed with him, you were in trouble. So this was their attempt to get Jesus in trouble. Can you imagine trying to trap with a trick question the creator of your mind, the one who knows your every thought? Well, let's move on to the trick question that the Sadducees had for Jesus. It begins in verse 23. And what does Jesus' answer reveal? It reveals their narrow-mindedness. It reveals the fact that they were not going to believe anything that they could not see with their eyes. And then we have the test question that begins in verse 34. The question is, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, as you know, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. So his answer to them revealed their error of arrogance. You see, they were so arrogant that they looked down their noses on everybody else. They were the religious. They were the ones who kept the rules. And they were the ones who were elevated over everyone else. But let me say, if you're looking down your nose at others, your socks are showing because you're standing on your head. And a good rabbi would now say, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. In other words, figure that one out. But what does Jesus' answer mean to us? all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments? It means simplify the goal of Scripture. It is love. On these two commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. All of God's commandments point to that, to love. If you love God with all your heart and you love your neighbor as yourself, you don't look down on anybody. You are keeping all the law. And then we have question 4, the terminal question, the final question, the last question. And Jesus asked it. He says to the Pharisees that were gathered there, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" Well, they responded, David, because their main problem with Jesus was that he claimed to be the Son of God. And so Jesus responds, and you can read it clearly as you study chapter 22. But he was saying to them, you claim that I am not the Son of God. And for us, it is the ultimate question. The final question that he asked is the ultimate question for us. And that is, what do you think about the Christ? Then, because we read at the end of chapter 22, the last verse, no one could say a word in reply. And from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. And then chapter 23 includes the 7 woes. Chapter 23, he just tells it the way it is. As if to say to these religious leaders, if you are not mad enough to crucify me now, you will be when I get through with this speech. And he laid it out. Now, chapter 24, it's interesting that the disciples asked Jesus about the beauty of the temple. And then we read in verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives. So they asked that question as they were leaving the temple area. But they walked that short distance up the Mount of Olives, where they were, as Luke tells us, they would spend the night all that week. They would spend the night there as he taught in the temple courts during the day. So what we have is chapter 24 and chapter 25 is around the campfire, where they are spending the night, most likely in a cave hewn out for an olive press. And it's like campfire talk. And Jesus is telling them. So read chapter 24 like he's there around the fire and everyone is just laying there and listening, and he's telling about the end times. And then in chapter 25, he says, during those end times, this is what the kingdom of heaven will be like. And then the last part of chapter 25, it's not a parable. A lot of people think it is, but he clearly states, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory. And so read that, understanding that they're around the campfire, they're about to fall asleep, they're now laying down, and then look at the beginning of chapter 26. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, as you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. So Jesus is telling them campfire stories. He's telling them campfire stories about how it's all going to end and what it's really going to be like. and then he rolls over and says good night. Enjoy your walk with Jesus on this Tuesday as we think about that Tuesday before the cross.